we're going to take the most traditional approach. And when I say the most traditional approach, it's actually the most traditional approach of this last century. Okay, not before that. Every generation has its own way of doing this. This was a particularly popular one. The name of this type of approach is New Criticism. By the way, one thing that's going to frustrate the absolute heck out of you, the New Criticism is now the old criticism, but it's still called the New Criticism. Okay? So it's the old New Criticism. It's part of a movement called modernism. Modernism is also over with. So what do you call the movement after modernism? Postmodernism. And postmodernism looks like it might be on its last legs. You never know exactly when until after the fact, but let's say it is. What are we going to call the next one? Post-post or new classicism. So, you know, it tends to be oxymoronic to the extreme. Okay? But let me give you a bit of context before I go into what this actually refers to. Okay, when we're talking about the new critics, we are talking about a group of people who were around at the turn of the 20th century and well into it, but at the turn of the 20th century. And what they were seeing was a world that was, what do you think? Yes? Getting much smaller, much faster than it had ever done before. And it was the first time this was happening. Okay. Technology was making it unbelievably small. And technology was introducing them to all kinds of different people. But this creates a bunch of problems. For one thing, if you're going to have all this faith in technology, and they did, you might, for example, label a ship as being unsinkable. Okay? Would any of you get on a ship that was labeled unsinkable?
No.
Why not?
Not true.
Exactly. Are you telling me we couldn't build an unsinkable ship today?
Yeah, pretty much.
So you don't have that much faith in technology, do you? If I built the uncrashable airplane, would you ever get anywhere near it? In fact, it's so safe we don't put any safety equipment on it. No life rafts, no life preservers. You'd be like, I'm going to die before I get to the end of the runway. Okay? But they did. They had that faith in technology. The other part of it was, since the world was changing so rapidly, they thought, or most people thought they were living in a completely, they were suffering from the same feeling that teenagers have. You know, teenagers look at their parents and they go, well, you didn't grow up with this, therefore you don't understand it. Okay? And guess what? They're right. What might you see at your grandmother's house if you were to visit tomorrow? A record player, or maybe a VCR. What would the clock be doing on the VCR?
The grandfather clock?
No. A VCR? That would be the coolest VCR I ever saw. No, but what would the clock on the VCR be doing? Flashing 12. Nobody knows how to set that thing. Okay? You, on the other hand, are like, I'm so past that. DVDs are old for us now. So obviously it's possible to fall for this illusion. So for many of the writers it was like, well, what use are the classics? After all, they didn't grow up in the world I'm growing up in. So that's part of the background noise. The other part is an interesting one. If I have a sense of aesthetics that is established in Europe, aesthetics is the study of what is beautiful, right? So if I'm looking around and I see something beautiful, I can tell you why it's beautiful, right? Because I grew up in this culture, correct? So for example, if I go to the palace at Versailles in France, it's ornate, it's got all of these features to it, and you go, oh, that's beautiful. If you see other palaces in Europe, same thing. And you might know what ugly looks like. Anybody been to a casino? No. Okay. So we have this sense of aesthetics. What happens when we look at other cultures, though? Yeah.
We compare.
Well, how? I mean, on what basis?
We view our view as the defining view, and their view is absent or void or something.
Fair enough. So if I look, for example, at a very, very old statue, thousands and thousands of years old, and it is this very unrealistic depiction of a woman with a very large belly, no arms, no legs, no face, and that's taught in all the art classes, right? The Venus of Willendorf. If I'm seeing that particular sculpture, I might sit there and say, well, it's good for its time. But obviously by our standards, it's ugly, primitive. What about Egyptian art? Anybody like it? Would you consider it sophisticated?
For the time period, maybe.
Yeah, but it's two-dimensional. So you might sit there and say, well, for its time it was something. But the Greeks, now they had real art. And then you go and say, Leonardo da Vinci, oh, the Mona Lisa, that's a masterpiece. Well, you're making these assumptions based on the way you were socialized in your culture. Yes?
Isn't that ethnocentric?
I'm sorry?
Ethnocentric?
Absolutely, it's ethnocentric. And up until the 20th century, you could almost get away with being ethnocentric because you didn't see much from other cultures. Yes, the nobility did. So, for example, there was a trend to do Chinese art in many of the European palaces, but common people never saw this. Well, 20th century comes around. The world has gotten much smaller. There are colonies everywhere. Common people are working in those colonies, and they're coming home and they're saying, wait a minute. If I look at a Japanese artwork, is it inferior to a Western artwork? No, but it is different. So what set of aesthetics am I supposed to use? Is Indian art superior or inferior? How do you make such a judgment? Okay. Let's say I'm teaching a literature course in Japan, and I am teaching Shakespeare's Hamlet. Okay. Everybody here know the basics of that story? Okay. Hamlet is a young prince. His father is murdered. His mother remarries his uncle. Okay. Now, for those of us who, and it is the Lion King, absolutely. And I'll get back to that in just a second because that's a good point. So, and we know who's the bad guy in the story, the uncle, and we know it because in the Disney version that's played by Scar. Okay. And it has Scar any redeeming qualities? Does Scar have any redeeming qualities? No. He hangs out with hyenas. We know hyenas are bad. Okay. So there's the bad guy. So here are my Japanese students. They are very well educated. They are understanding the text correctly, and they come back and they write a paper. Hamlet is the bad guy. He is listening to a demon, his father's ghost, and he is going against the rightful heir, the uncle, who has done nothing wrong. Now you might sit there and go, wait a minute. There's lots of textual evidence to show that, in fact, the uncle killed his brother. Well, yes, but from a Japanese perspective, a ghost is automatically a demon. They're evil. There is no such thing as a good ghost. Casper is unemployed in Japan. Okay? So, he is the bad guy. Hamlet, by listening to this demon, is a bad guy. Can I find evidence to show that Hamlet is not a nice guy? He sends his two best friends off knowing they're going to be killed. He sets his girlfriend up for total humiliation. He's not a good guy. Oh, and he murders a bunch of people. Okay, they're all by accident, but still. Try that as a criminal defense. I meant to kill this guy. Those were all innocent bystanders. Sorry. And suddenly, what am I supposed to? How am I supposed to grade those Japanese students? What grade should I give them? What would you give them?
Well, for what would we grade them on? Like understanding of the play.
Yeah.
It's a hard call.
Couldn't just be their perspective, like their interpretation.
Every interpretation is equally valid. So if you read Hamlet and you tell me it's a space aliens from the planet Xenon,
Well, no, because that's not like, anything similar. You know, they actually have like proof and like reason to believe.
if I look hard enough, can I not find that evidence?
Probably not, but it's a
I bet you I could.
Hamlet?
Sure. The greatest science fiction novel, science fiction play ever written.
I guess if it was like a different Hamlet.
Or you just paid attention to certain things. But the whole point here, that bothers me. Okay? It probably bothers a lot of people to think, well, wait a minute, not all interpretations are correct. I mean, for example, you're having a discussion with someone who chooses to see it in a negative light. You didn't mean it that way. Are they entitled to their opinion, or are you going to try to correct them?
I'm trying to correct.
What if I say, well, you know, it's just opinion? Except this is why someone's breaking up with you. Yeah, you might sit there and go, no, hold on a second. There's what you thought I said, and there's what I meant. That's not interpretation. There's the right answer. Okay. Even if I have to make up the right answer after the fact. Critics of that time came up with a way of handling the situation. One of the things they decided was that when you look at a text, you should not be looking at the surface layer. Okay, yes, European writing is different from Japanese writing, which is different from South American writing, which is different from African writing. So what? At the core of it, what is the universal appeal?
Good versus bad.
I'm sorry?
Good versus bad.
That's debatable, because one side's idea of good versus another's is debatable. But what do we all have in common? We're all born, we live, we die, we fall in love, we dislike certain things. The human experience is universal. So what they said you should look for is the universal human experience in any text. Teachers love this approach. Why? Yes?
Well, one, I imagine if all the teachers or all the students hand in paper based off that, it makes your job a lot easier.
Of course it does.
Secondly, it lets you know that you're effective in getting people to dig through the information.
Well, yes, but it also makes for one right answer. There's only one possible interpretation. All learned readers reading carefully will come to the same conclusion about a particular work. And all of you who are right now looking at me going, yeah, right, you're not new critics. Okay, you're in the generation past the new critics, so don't put your assumption on it. That's what the new critics believed. And they said, look, if you read carefully enough, you will always find the same answer. And the tools of the new critics, you've all run across already. Do all of you know what a metaphor is? That's because that's a tool in new criticism. I mean, obviously it was used beforehand and since then, but that approach of focusing in on it. Close reading. You read very carefully and you dig out the right meaning of it. That's new criticism. It's infinitely teachable. Look at the narrator, look at the point of view, look at the metaphors, look at the symbols. How is the language set up? All of that. Okay. So, all of you who know what I'm talking about right now, were trained as new critics. Okay. And the reason was because the schools loved it. And it worked. I mean, it was a very powerful approach.